Hey guys, Robert Carrillo here, and I am giving the lecture here for this week on rhythms of life or sacred rhythms, spiritual rhythms of living. And this is a fairly big topic in the world of spiritual forming because it has so much to do with what we accomplish in life and what happens to us in life. And it's kind of the basket you put all the eggs in, how we live our lives. What are the habits that we develop? What are the rhythms that we work out in our life, which become, long-term, what really shapes our entire life. I want to start out with this quote from Ruth Haley Barton, who wrote a fantastic book, if you want to read it at any point, called Sacred Rhythms. But her quote is this: it's many of us have more clearly developed plans for finances, further education, home improvements, and physical fitness than we do for our spiritual lives. And unfortunately, it's a sad truth. And I'm not even talking about the world, but it's a sad truth in many churches and among many Christians that we put more thought into our finances or our physical workout or scheduling or buying a house, whatever, but we don't really stop and think through about the life that we are living and how we're building it. Who are we becoming? One of the rules of one of the understandings of spiritual formation is that we are all in fact being formed. The question is, into what? And how are we being spiritually formed? I mean, everybody is getting formed in one way or another. Most people not by God, more by the world. But living an intentional life where you are building that life to be the life that you want to live. That's what Sacred Rhythms is about, or Spiritual Rhythms is all about. We start out, of course, always with the example of Jesus, and I'm reading a verse in Luke 22:39. Says, and he came out and proceeded, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples also followed him. There were things about Jesus's life that were his rhythms, and they knew it. I mean, they knew it. They just went with it because they knew this is what Jesus does. You get up in the morning, you look around, Jesus is gone. Well, he must have went to the mountaintop, or he must have went out into the desert, because that's what he does. Or when he goes into Jerusalem, where does he go? He goes to the Mount of Olives. Why? Because if you've ever been there, it's a hillside. It overlooks Jerusalem. It's a fantastic place to pray. It's a great place to be able to see the whole city, the hustle bustle, and pray for everybody. And they knew that's where he would go. They knew that's what he does. This is what Jesus does. And so, of course, they followed him. And the significant word there in Greek is ethos, where we get the English concept of ethos, your way of being, how you live your life. What are your practices? What are your habits? It says in 2 Timothy 3, verse 10, Paul writes, you, however, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance. Because they were close, because they traveled together, Timothy really knew Paul's way of life. He knew his ethos. He knew his rhythms. And, you definitely get the feeling that Timothy followed the rhythms of Paul. He learned from him. And it's what we hope people will see in our lives. And it really is what they do see, what that people don't, they're impacted, they're impressed, not by what we say as much as how we live our lives. The most powerful sermon is our life. And we know that, right? We know that. We oftentimes forget that, and we oftentimes lose sight of that. But how we live our lives, what is our daily habit? What are the things that we generally do every single day? That's what is the biggest sermon of our lives. That's why so oftentimes when you go to a funeral or a memorial service, they're so powerful, because everybody shares about that person's ethos. And that's what ends up impacting everybody, right? In 1 Corinthians 4, Paul writes, for this reason I have sent to you Timothy, my son, whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord. He will remind you of my way of life in Christ Jesus, which agrees with what I teach everywhere in every church. There's a couple things. There's a whole lot in this verse, actually, but there's a couple things I want to draw out. One of them is just the fact that he could send Timothy because Timothy has picked up Paul's rhythms, right? He had picked up Paul's ways or Paul's ethos. And that's the thing about ethos is they are infectious, and it's amazing to me how whatever we do as a leader, whatever a leader does is very quickly imitated, even if he's not asking people to imitate him or asking people to do what he does. It's just how it works, right? It's human nature. We imitate our leaders, and that can be to a great advantage. And of course, here he's saying that Timothy will remind you of his rhythm or his way of living. But the other thing that's really significant here is he says, which agrees with what I teach everywhere in every church. His life, his practice, his rhythm of life, how he lived his life, what his ethos was, matched what his teaching was. And that's incredibly important. There's the big challenge right there, that what we are teaching, what we are preaching is how we are living. And I'm not talking about not being a hypocrite. I mean, obviously, we don't want to be a hypocrite. But more than that, hypocrisy is when you are playing the game, right? You're coming across one way, but you're really living another way. I'm talking about something that's really a lot more innocent than that. I mean, I'm talking about you're preaching something, but you're not really living it up to it yourself. You're preaching to seek the kingdom first, but you're tied up with other things. You're preaching, that prayer is the most important thing you'll do in a day, and yet that's getting squeezed out of your life. You're teaching people that they've got to be in the Word and walking with God, but your quiet times are getting squeezed out, or they're just insufficient. Your quiet times are not enough. And so you yourself don't have the strength or the power to live the life that you're promoting, to live the life that you're telling everybody that they need to live. And that's an important thing. That's very significant, that we live the life that we are preaching and teaching. And I don't mean that in a way to throw some guilt on us or pile on some more to-dos, but in a way that demonstrates we've got to make sure that we are living a life in such a way that gives us the time, the energy, the power to override things, to be spiritual, to be led by God, exactly what we're preaching and calling everybody else to do. So, so sometimes the first thing we got to do is just ask some important questions. Does my life reflect my priorities? When people look at my life, do they see, you can see his priorities? What would they think your priorities are if they look at your life? Would they think it's money? Would they think it's fitness? Would they think it's fun? Would they think, what is it? And not that any of those things are bad. None of those things are bad. But we have to make sure that our life matches our priorities, right? Does my schedule reflect my priorities, how I spend my time? There's only, there's some things that we have absolutely limited quantity, right? We have a limited amount of money. Okay, so that says a lot, how we spend that. We have a limited time a limited amount of time, how we spend our time. What do we do with our time? That has a huge impact on our spirituality and how we do spiritually, how we spend our attention, our energy, how much energy we put into things, how much of our talent is used in things, our ability to focus. These are all things that are limited in our lives. And so what we do with those limited things says a lot about us, right? Our time, our money, our energy, our focus, our attention. We have limited amount of attention. We think that, attention is unlimited. So we multitask. Well, I can do 5 things at once. The truth is everything suffers. The more we do, the more everything suffers. The whole idea of multitasking is a huge lie. All kinds of research has proven that the quality of everything you do goes down with the number of things you're doing. And so even learning how to be still and focus on God, or to focus on reading the scriptures or in prayer. Those things make a huge difference. We think that, well, I can pray and I can do this and that, and I can do, multiple things. The truth is the quality of everything starts to go down. And so what are the things that we give our full attention to? What are the things that we focus on? Living intentionally, asking those questions. What is important to me? Is it success? Is it power? Is it fame? Is it prestige? Is it fear? Is it admiration? And that list on that side, I know that list is like, of course we're going to say, no, it's not important to me. That's not what matters to me. What matters to me is spirituality, holiness, relationships, righteousness, purity, peace. Really, what is our practical ethos? What is the way we're living show? And even don't be fooled by our hearts, because our hearts can be deceitful above all things, right? The fact is, the list on the left is important to all of us. Our success, our power, what we can accomplish, how much authority we have, our level of fame, being known, what is our reputation, having prestige, being looked up to, being respected. What are the things we're afraid of? We're afraid of people criticizing us. We're afraid of our peers. We're afraid of, what are the people I look up to going to think of me? The desire, the hunger to be admired, to have young people look up to us and think, ooh, you're awesome. I mean, don't be fooled even for a second to think that those aren't factors in our hearts and in your heart. They are. They absolutely are. The question is, are you dealing with them? Are you living in such a way that these things are getting dealt with? And we all aspire to have spirituality as our priority. Holiness is our priority. Relationships. So the question is not do we desire these things? Of course we desire these things. The question is it what we're living according to? Is it a centerpiece in our life? Are we developing a lifestyle that strengthens and holds these things up? That's the question we're talking about. That's what that's what the spiritual rhythms are all about, is making sure, living in such a way that the things that we want to get done every day, meditation, prayer, all those things that I got a list coming up here, that those things are happening. Those things are getting done. In Ephesians 5:14, it says, for this reason, it says, awake, sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Therefore, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Just living smart. That's basically what Paul's saying. That be very careful how you walk. Obviously, he's talking about our lifestyle here. To be awake. Don't be asleep. Don't be out of it. Don't just go through life. The opposite of being mindful is being mindless. Just mindless living. And that's really how most people live their lives. The opposite of mindlessness is mindfulness, being mindful, being intentional about how we're living and the things that we're doing. How am I spending my days and the time that, the Bible talks about, teach me, O Lord, to number my days. In other words, to count each day, make it count, make it matter. And not as oh my gosh, I've got to every second be doing something important, but just being intentional, just being purposeful in the things that we do. He says, so be careful how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise. Make the most of your time. And that doesn't mean pack it in as much as you can. What that means is make the most out of it. That means that do what you intend to do, live as you intend to live, right? Don't let the urgency of life, don't get the rush of life. Hopefully you're reading John Mark Comer's book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Fantastic book that really goes into detail about this, because the days are evil. I mean, we know there's just so much garbage going on in our world, so many bad things that will affect us, that will influence us, that will alter our lives in ways that we don't really want to be altered. So he's basically says, don't be a fool. I mean, literally he's saying, don't be foolish. Don't be a fool, but understand the will of the Lord. Be aware of the will of the Lord. Be aware, the ultimate question, the question behind the question of how I should live my life is, what does God want me to do with my life, right? I mean, on one level, the question is, how do I want to live my life? But as disciples of Jesus, I know the question behind that question is, how does God want me to live my life? Know what the will of the Lord is. Henry Nouwen once said, the spiritual life is not a life. A spiritual life is not a life before, after, or beyond our everyday existence. Okay, it's not what we're going to do. It's not what we've done in the past. It's what we're doing. He says, no, the spiritual life can only be real when it is lived in the midst of the pains and joys of the here and now. Spiritual life is all about what you did today. It's what you're doing tomorrow. It's how are you living your life right now? That's what the spiritual life is all about. And that's where disciplines of spirituality, of a spiritual life come in, whether it's Bible study, Bible reading, scripture memorization, prayers, centering prayer, affirmations. All of these things are just tools to help us live and be who we want to be. Live the life we want to live, be the person we want to be. And all of them have incredible power in and of themselves, whether it's fasting or practicing examen or gratitude or silence and solitude, meditation, contemplation. And I know you guys are all growing in this. You're taking your first steps, which is fantastic. These are tools to help us accomplish that, to know the Lord's will and live the Lord's will. These and the things that we decide, the habits that we're forming, and this is why I have you guys reading the classic readings every day, because it's just forming habits of being influenced, habits of meditation, habits of contemplation, that build a life that I know we all want. I know you want that life, right? And that's your rule of life, right? That's your soul care, how you take care of your soul. It's the habits that we form, our daily practices, and they all add up to the spiritual development of our life. So, all of this, there's different categories, and I know there's different ways that we approach it, but it boils down to living intentionally, right? Keeping first things first. How do you live that way? Living our lives so that we keep first things first. And we don't let first things get squeezed out. We keep first things first. What really matters. We therefore must plan what you do and do what you plan. That is the key. That's one of those maxims that you just never want to let go, or do only what only you can do. The more life, as you guys know, gets more and more complicated, and we have less and less free time. And that's what tends to happen, even though it shouldn't be that way, but it is what happens. And so we have to learn to streamline our lives to do what only we can do. Only you can take care of your soul. Nobody else can take care of your soul. And so you have to make sure your soul is being taken care of. And only you can live the life that you choose to live. And so you've got to make that happen. Now, there's a lot of other stuff that could happen, a lot of other stuff in our daily schedule. We live in a very interesting time that you would think, with all our inventions that make life easier, we would have a lot more leisure time, and time to contemplate and meditate, but we don't. We just end up packing it fuller and fuller and fuller, and we have to decide what to put in there. It's kind of like the purse principle, so somebody goes out and buys a bigger purse because their little purse is packed full. And what do? Well, we fill up the big purse, and now it's packed full. So they go out and get a backpack, and now what do? Now we got the backpack full. And we're actually making our life harder and harder because we're carrying more and more. But that is what ends up happening. So it's kind of the basket we put our eggs in, the spiritual rhythms of our life. How am I going to live this thing out? What am I going to put in there? Which of these disciplines am I going to practice regularly? Which of these disciplines are really going to direct my life, and I'm going to live my life according to? The last thing I want to read is just, this scripture, which you hear a lot in spiritual forming, because it's such a significant thing that Jesus said. Matthew 11:28, he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." It's it's a fascinating thing that he ends up saying, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." And, I don't think that a lot of people feel their Christian life is easy or light. I just read an article the other day that it was recently put out by the Barna Institute, that they called it the spiritual crisis in America, that 38% of ministers are seriously considering quitting. And another stat I read recently in a book about leadership, they did this massive study, and it was interesting because they studied all the leaders in the Bible, and they said only about 30% of them ended their lives well. And they did this research, and only 30% out of, I forget how many leaders they asked, these were ministers who led churches, and less than 30% of them felt like they ended well. It's a universal principle. It's a universal fact. This is what happens. And I think the key is that they never really capture, they never really understand what Jesus meant by this. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. And that we know it doesn't mean you won't work hard. We know it doesn't mean you won't sacrifice. We know it doesn't mean you won't suffer even. So what does it mean? And if Jesus promised that we'd go through hardships and difficulties, what does it mean? And I think the key is in the picture he paints of sharing a yoke. And as you guys know, probably that the way that the bulls would be trained is you'd have an old bull with a young bull. And the old bull already knew how to plow. It already knew, it was bigger, it was stronger, and it knew how to make the straight lines. And so the young bull would be paired, and the old bull was therefore carrying the majority of the weight of the yoke, but also teaching the young bull how to do it. And it wasn't that the young bull didn't have to work hard also, but the majority, the lion's share of the load was carried by the old bull. And of course, that's the picture that Jesus is painting, that we share our yoke with him. He'll carry the lion's share of it. He'll carry most of it. And in fact, what he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Let me teach you how to live this thing called life. Let me show you what to do daily. Look at my example. We cannot be Christians without the Christ, right? We cannot be the apprentice disciples of Jesus without Jesus. We look at his life, his daily life. What are the things he did? What are the practices? What was his rhythm of life? And he says, "For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And there's a world of teaching behind that concept of rest for your souls. Teaching that, frankly, we don't really hear a whole lot about. And we don't hear a whole lot of sermons, and we don't hear a whole lot of classes. Recently, it's suddenly becoming popular, which is great. It's wonderful. Hopefully not just a trend in the church. Hopefully that we're growing wiser and understanding the role of rest. And I'm talking about Sabbath and sabbatical, and even I would even say I would include the silence and solitude, the daily silence and solitude in that. It's been life-changing for me. About 2 years ago, I decided that I'm going to block out 3 to 4 hours every morning being with God. It has been life-changing for me. Michelle does the same, and it's just opened up so much more of God for us and our understanding and our strengthening by him. And again, it's not that our life is easy and the ministry is easy, but yet carrying the yoke with Jesus, where we're learning how to make sure we are yoked with Jesus, makes all the difference in the world. And I think that as leaders, as disciples of Jesus, this is incredibly important. And the practicals are learning that rhythm. What do I do on a daily basis? What do I make sure I do? And it's daily, it's weekly, it's monthly, it's yearly. There are things to do every year. There are things to do every month. There are things to do every week. And there are things to do every day that line up with our priorities. My time reading, my time meditating, my time in prayer. And I know we can think, well, yeah, but my life's so busy. That's exactly the point. Is the busier our life, the more time we need with the Lord, the more time we need to make sure that the Lord is an integral part of our daily schedule, stopping and praying. And there's a lot of resources to help us do that, including even apps. But that's the importance of spiritual rhythms and how we live our lives, living our life in such a way that it's a blast, that our yoke is easy and our burden is light. That's the will that Jesus has for all of us. So I'll stop there. Love to be able to have a discussion about this. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about this next class. Take care and see you guys at the next class.